1,000%. I really value connection. Like I really value who can I introduce to who, but I also just think it comes from just like a genuine kindness. Like I want people to get to know each other. Like nothing that anyone is doing is inherently quote unquote new,
Mhm.
but the creativity that comes from your mind is your unique asset. And so, AI is incredible, right? Because it can help us do a lot of things, but AI can generate ideas, but AI can't necessarily generate ideas that somebody else may not have like completely thought of before because it's pulling from a place of where content already exists. I'm very much someone that like, cuz I feel like I consume a lot of content in a day, probably more so than the average person does, just because of like the nature of my business and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we're always doing content. Like we're doing content like all day long. And so by the end of the day, like my brain is so fried from like reading all this content, hearing all this content, watching different things, writing different things,
Mm.
that I'm like, just give me the information that I need.
Today, I'm talking with Simona Costantini on the Poly and Content Creator Spotlight. I'm still kind of getting used to the whole intro there. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on here with you.
I'm excited to have you. You're a podcaster, a CEO, content creator, and podcast producer. So it's definitely going to be good to have another podcast face on the show because first one, basically.
Really? Okay, but I love that
Yeah.
because we get to nerd out on all things
Yeah.
podcasting and content and all of the above, and those are my favorite things. So that's awesome. I'm so excited.
Me too. And that's the thing. Like, well, some other guests might have had a podcast. You're the first person that's actually like the podcast as like your main thing. And obviously,
True.
too, it's one of those things where podcasting is its own unique thing. People think that, okay, there's videos, there's blogging, and you can obviously repurpose into each of them in
Yep.
podcasting to the whole trifecta. But it is interesting to think about how, like, when you have that as your main thing, it changes your perspective.
1,000%. And honestly, I never thought that I would be in the podcast space doing any of this work to begin with, but
Mhm.
it's just really interesting how like that journey goes. But I really think that like podcasting is such a special medium because it combines so many different things together. And
Mhm.
that's just what I love the most about it.
What got you started as a content creator?
Okay, good question. So I started my podcast at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019,
Mm.
and I had like a huge aversion to even using social media. Like I didn't like social media, I didn't like creating content, I didn't like doing any of that kind of stuff. And so when I launched my show, I launched to like no one. You know what I mean? Like there was no audience, there was no nothing. I had no brand, I had nothing. Like I had this message that I wanted to share. And I knew that if I could just, put my words together and get on a podcast, that I think that it would impact people. And that was my intention with creating my podcast, was to help one person feel less alone. That's always what I wanted with my show. And so I've been doing that now for like almost 5 years. I'm going into my 5th year. So that's all awesome. And like that's all great. But I actually didn't really even start creating content until I launched my podcast, because I just, I didn't really realize the power of content at the time. I didn't realize how important it was to create that community online and to share like snippets and clips and like to talk about the things that you're doing online and like why that's so important. So honestly, I kind of fell into content creation, but I didn't ever want to be there, if that makes any sense. Like in the past, like now I enjoy it. Like I like creating content. I like showing up. I like, talking about the things that I know. But back then I just had this like huge block when it came to social media. And it wasn't even like the tech part of it. It was just like I didn't want to be seen in that way, that big way, you
Yeah.
know?
It seems like some of the best content creators are the ones that fall into it and the ones that have a message to share, like you said. I've met a lot of podcasters who started a podcast and they didn't have that message. So they did it for the sake of doing it. And
Yeah.
they didn't last as long, if that makes sense.
Well, that's so true. Okay. Because then you get things like pod fade and you just like stop doing the stuff that you want to do. And the reason why that happens is because they're not anchored back into something that is substantial. They're not anchored back into a bigger why. They're not accessing that piece of them, that fueling that like hunger that's inside you, that you have to go and you have to create what you want to create and you need to share that message. It's more like, I'm doing this thing because I feel like I should, because everybody else is doing it. So I'm going to create this podcast, not because I actually want to, but because that's what's expected of me in this day and age of content creation. Like everyone has a
Mhm.
podcast, right? And so if everyone has a podcast, I should have a podcast. But the challenge with that is, if you are only looking at it through that lens, then you are literally creating content that does not resonate with your own self and with your soul, I'm going to say, and it's not really in alignment with you, and you're just doing it because you feel like you should, not out of purpose or service or like a bigger reason and a bigger anchor as to why you actually want to do it.
Right. And what was your anchor for happiness then? Like what brought you to that
Mm.
particular idea?
That's a good question. So I had this moment back in 2018 where I really just disliked who I was. I didn't really like how I looked, how I acted, the type of person that I was, how I showed up in the world. I used
Yeah.
to be a really gossipy person and would talk badly about the people that I loved. And I remember waking up one day and I was talking to my then boyfriend turned fiance turned husband turned ex-husband now, and I had said to him, I just like I really hate I hate everything about myself. And he looked at me and he's like, well, what are you going to do about it? He's like, are you just going to continue talking about it, or are you actually going to do something to change? And I was like, okay, well, that's rude. That was my initial thought. I was like, that's rude. And then I was like, okay, but you're right. And I feel like I need to do something to shift the course of my life. Otherwise, I'm just going to end up stuck in this place and continue to go down this path of self-destruction, like a lot of us do. And you end up in this spot and you're like, how did I get here, and why am I here, and why am I doing this? And that's where I was headed. And so I started going to therapy, which is the first time in my life that I ever did that. And I started discovering new things about what it meant to understand, shame and grief and
Mm.
fear and loss and abandonment and happiness and joy, contentment, purpose, all these key things. And then I thought to myself, well, if I'm learning all of this, there's got to be somebody else out there in the world who is learning this too, or who would need to learn this, or who will benefit from hearing this. And so I just started sharing what I was learning. It was kind of like an open journal. Like it was
Mhm.
kind of like, instead of writing a journal, I was just speaking out my journal. And that's kind of what it was. And then it started to resonate with people. And people started to reach out to me and be like, hey, like I really like what you shared about that. Or I really liked, this thing that you said. And like that makes a lot of sense. And I feel the same way. And that it just kind of spiraled. And then I just got so curious, in a world where we have everything we could want. I'm going to say specifically for North America, how is it that so many people are so unhappy and so unfulfilled?
Yeah.
So then I just really started to try to understand, and like want to understand why people are unhappy and how can we cultivate more happiness. And then that's just literally the conversations that I have on my podcast is centered just around that.
It's interesting too. And so did you start out as a solo cast and went into interviews as well?
I did. And so I would say for like the first, I want to say it was like the first year, maybe the first 6 months, I did only solo episodes. And then I started meeting new people, and I was like, oh, like you should be a guest on my podcast. Like that would be really
Yeah.
fun. Like let's have a conversation about it. And because I wanted to understand their path, because the show for me was such a critical like growth piece. Like I wanted to understand their path and like how they got from where they were to where they are, and what was the specific thing that they needed to overcome. What was that hurdle that they needed to overcome in order to find the joy they were looking for and like live the life that they actually wanted to live. And then I started interviewing different people. And so I think for about 2 years, I just did interviews like that. And then the
Mm,
shift into understanding happiness specifically had only happened within like the last year. And I think I've done about like, I want to say like maybe like 60 interviews specific to that. We're over 200 episodes now. I think I'm at like 200. And at the time of recording this, we just went live with episode 214. So
nice.
yeah. Yeah. And so it's had like quite a few iterations. And I think that's an important piece, is understanding that things are allowed to change and evolve and breathe and be new and be different. And it can look different than how it did when you first started. And that's okay. Even if you're creating content online, doesn't matter what you're doing in your life, it
Oh
can
yeah, and
change.
doesn't even matter what kind of content too. Is like it's gonna keep
Yeah.
evolving. as you expressed your story there, it kept making me think about comparing back to my story when it came to how I got started too. Like you said, you started 2018. I think mine was like 2017, 2018, but I started solo, just pure
Mm.
solo.
Love
And
that.
it wasn't actually until 2020. So actually a year and a half later after you started doing interviews where I started doing any sort of interview. I didn't know how to get started on that front. But as you
Mhm.
said, it evolves. I had maybe three different, not different, but three semi different podcasts kind of simultaneously. And I realized they were all the same niche, all the same topic. It was not wise for me to split myself. So I combined them all into one season. Because when I first had the idea of doing the interview, I only had two episodes on this Polycast kind of show, not this show, but my other show.
Yeah.
And I was like, two episodes, even though I've been podcasting for years, I only have two episodes on this show. My guests are
Mhm.
going to see that. That might give them a perception that I may not know what I'm doing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to combine all my three shows into one
Hmm.
stream. And that way I have 42 episodes like behind me. Because at that point I
Yeah.
had a decent amount.
Yeah.
And that way when I have my first guest, they'll be like, okay, they can have a little bit more confidence in it. And I think it worked
Mhm.
because now I'm around 230, so around the same point as
Good for
you.
you.
But like it's like, similar how we were kind of interleaved there in the stories.
Totally. Did you ever take a break?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, in between, I do seasons. Do you do seasons?
I don't. I just go straight through, but I took a 1-year unplanned hiatus. I think it
I
was in
definitely,
2022.
mm, I definitely take like dips where I would go from maybe having like 4 a month, like 4 interviews a month, to having maybe just a couple or something like that. I'm not super strict on the consistency, which is not necessarily good, but it's also one of those things where I did maybe 60 interviews in 2020. It was insane the amount that I got through, and I went on like 30 shows myself as a guest. Like
Good
I
for you.
I almost burned out from it though. That's the thing. Like it's dangerous when you do that
That's a
many
lot of
that quick.
content. Oh, yeah. It's a lot of content.
By the end of either 2020 or 2021, I had to do 40 episodes in 40 days, basically. Because it was just one of the things I was so behind, I had to catch up. And then the next year, I barely had maybe like 15 or 20 throughout the whole year. So it was one of
Wow.
those things where it was really dense, then really spread out. But I think
Mhm.
that's kind of what you're saying there, too.
Mhm. Yeah, totally. I think my, my hiatus was super unplanned
Uh
because
huh.
I just, like, released an episode in, like, I think it was, like, April 2021, and I just, like, never went back until no, it was 2022 because then I never went back until, like, April 2023, and it was an entire year planned hiatus. The last thing that people say, sorry, unplanned hiatus, which is the last thing that people say that you should do. You know what I mean? Like, you never
Yeah.
ghost your audience, right? And like, I'm a producer, I know that. And I was just like, it is what it is. You know what I mean? But I think that sometimes we have to we have to shift what we're doing to make it so that we're continuously inspired and excited to show up for what it is that we're creating. Because if we're not excited and we're not inspired, it comes through in the content that you're doing. Like the energy that you bring to stuff is so key. Like if I sat here and I was like, "Hey, Dustin, yeah, it's really nice to meet you today here and have this." Like people are gonna be like, "What is the matter with her? Like, is she
Yeah.
okay? Like, why is she even trying to be a guest on this podcast?" Oh man.
It is interesting that you bring up the energy, though. That's part of the reason why I started this secondary interview series, because the first interview series is about polymaths, people who are multidisciplinary, and
Mm.
the people that I would have on
I don't even know
sometimes.
what that is. Polymath. What is that?
A polymath is someone who's like a multi-expert, someone with many disciplines that are pretty much expert level
Oh.
and
Okay,
very
that's why I don't know
curious.
about it because I'm not that.
Well, you could
I'm
be
just kidding.
polymathic, but it's one of those things where there was a lot of people who I had on the show who didn't see themselves as like a generalist or a polymath when they might have
Hmm,
literally had like, let's say they're a PhD in science, but then they also were like a ballerina or some kind of artsy kind of person, but also had a hobby. Like
cool.
those are three different disciplines. You're polymathic, but having those three different levels of expertise. And so I would interview people like that, and some of them might have been content creators. At least like 40% of them were content creators. But when I talked to them about content creation, that was only a fourth or a third, maybe, of the conversation. And I love
Hmm.
content creation as a subject. It's one of those things where I get passionate about. When I have guests
Mhm.
like you on the show, we could talk shop. You and I dove right in. I actually skipped my icebreaker question. Excuse me. I skipped my icebreaker question because I was so excited to talk to you. And
Oh,
it was
what's
one
the
of those things.
icebreaker question? I feel like I need to know now.
I always ask people to share something about themselves that no one knows about you.
I dog sit for fun. Actually, no, hold on. People know that. If you follow me on social media,
So
you know that. I
it's,
don't know. That's a
it's
good
a hard question, and it makes
That's a
everything
hard
else
question.
easy after that.
That's a really okay, here's something. You want something? It's not content related, but it's just life
Yeah.
related. I have a deep fear of being abducted.
I feel like that's a pretty normal fear though, but a deep fear
You
is pretty strong. Yeah, because I mean, no one wants to be abducted, but I think also
think?
women have to face that fear a lot more often than men do. Obviously, that's one
True.
thing too. But like that, having a deep fear, that it makes it's understandable. It's unique, but it's understandable.
Fair enough. What would yours be?
Oh crap. I, I don't know if many people know this about me, but I want to move to Singapore. I did write a blog post about it a long time ago, but that's a
Oh.
place that I'm like dying to move to. I'm probably going to go to Austin first, then Singapore because it's like closer. But I even have a poster on my wall, a little mini one that has Singapore on it to remind me
Oh
like
my
what the
gosh,
goal
I love
is.
that. Well, I can't wait to come visit when you live there.
Yes, please. And it's one of those things too where that question makes it really easy. I think I stole that from John Lee DeMoss, who obviously is one
Mhm.
of the bigger podcasters in the world. But I don't know exactly where else I was going to take that, but I'm glad that we were able to share that moment too, because I love
I
having
know,
that
I was just really
question.
curious. I was just really
Yeah.
curious about it. But it is a good point. And I think to your point of content like in general,
Hmm.
I always tell my clients, and I do this for myself, starting out your episodes with something that's intentional instead of, so tell me about your life. You know how people will say
Yeah,
that,
like
like,
where are you going to go
tell
with
me your
that?
story. And it's like, what part of my story do you want to know? Like, there's a lot of different parts of my story. Like, which one? And then it's like sometimes you get a mixed bag and it's like things
Mhm.
that like you actually like, oh, I really didn't want, like, I didn't want to go there. That's not where I wanted to go. And so I always tell my clients, and I do this for myself too, start your podcast episodes with a hard hitting question that's going to help you streamline where you're going with the conversation. So on Happiness Happens, I start every single interview with, what does happiness mean to you? And then the person will have to think about it. And I don't even tell them the question in advance.
Yeah.
I make them answer it right on the spot. And I actually tell them, Dustin, I tell them before I hit record, as I'm hitting record, I say, so let's say you were on my podcast. I'd say, okay, Dustin, like, let's start the show. I is going to count us in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And my first question for you, as this is counting down, I want you to think about this. My first question for you is, what does happiness mean to you? And then they like think about it and they're thinking about it. And then we start the show and I'm like, like, hey, hey, Dustin, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today. And then you'll say the same thing, blah, blah, blah. And then I just go into that first question. And then everything else follows suit because
Hmm.
everybody's expertise falls into their own description of happiness, what I've learned. And it's
It's
really
interesting.
interesting.
Well, what that really gets me excited about is the psychology of podcasting. And there's something I can nerd out
Yes.
with you about too is that Lewis Howes, who's a great podcaster,
Love him.
he had a really amazing like video or post that was talking about the pre-show is the show. So when I started doing interviews, I knew that, for example, for one thing, I needed to shut up and active listen. That was a skill that I needed to learn. I
Mm.
feel like I was more prepared than most people to do interviews because I knew what I needed to look for. I did way too much research. I did way too much preparation before I got started, and I should have just actually, started doing it. But my point was, the one thing I really needed to work on is learning to shut up. And even right now, I'm gonna
Mm.
maybe go on a little tangent, but it's super exciting
Please.
for both of us. Like I think that you're gonna love it. Is that even before the show, I had my pre-show mentions like I told you about, like, hey, do you need to grab a drink of water, go to the bathroom? It helps the guests get relaxed. I also mentioned too that, hey, we're not recording yet, everything's really relaxed. Some people have a
Mhm.
fear of being on camera, even if they've been on camera
Mhm.
before. Telling them that allows them to get a second to relax before we actually get started. And then you can even chat a little bit first too. Those understanding that psychology there helps really make the content way better. And even when we get started, I send you guys the questions beforehand. At least I try to. Like 99% of the time I do. Sometimes you might forget, but for the most part, I send the questions ahead of time. I do not send that icebreaker question like you mentioned, the share something about yourself no one knows about you. So that way it does
Ah.
give a small curveball to you. If you can handle that, everything else you've either mentally prepared for or actually made answers to beforehand.
Yeah.
And if you read the questions, but it's okay. But
You
it's
know
one of
what? I
those.
do it purposely. I do it
Yeah, no,
purposely.
I'd rather be.
Sometimes I will, and like but honestly, most of the times I won't because it's like
Yeah,
I want to be. I want to give you an authentic answer, and like
me too.
finish your story. And I'll tell you my thought after as to why I don't.
No, I'm actually the same way as you. I like to improv my answers too. I was just giving you a little trouble there. But the other thing I was going to mention is that, oh crap, what was the train of thought? Oh no, finish your story because I'll remember in a moment.
Yeah. Okay. There was the very first podcast episode that I ever did. The very first interview that I ever did. I was a guest on this podcast, and it was. I don't even remember what the show was about. She sent me questions in advance, and I was so nervous about the podcast interview. I had no idea how I was going to answer them. I literally
Mhm.
sat with the questions and I wrote out answers. Okay. And it was an audio only podcast at the time because, like, that's how long ago it was. And I sat there and she asked me the question and I read my answer because we were not on camera. It was just audio. So she asked me the question. I read my answer, asked me the question, read my answer. And I was like, okay, but I feel like I could have done this without the stress of having to know or be, like what the questions are going to be in advance. And I don't know. I just, for my own self, it's always worked better
Mhm.
that way. Other people need to know the questions in advance and that works better for them too. So it's like you're giving people the option to do
Yeah.
both, which is
That's
perfect.
that's what I was gonna say. It's like I literally only send them for the people who want to know what they are. Some people
Love
don't
that.
look at it, some people do. And honestly, I really only send the email mainly for the link, so you could have the link to come to the meeting, that kind of thing. But
Exactly.
there was one other thing too. You say you mentioned the same question to every guest. There's only
Hmm.
one question besides the icebreaker that I do for every guest on my other show, and that's what is a polymath to you? Kind of similar to
Hmm.
the one that you framed. I mention it usually around halfway through the interview so that we kind of have a chance to warm up first. And like you said, you didn't know what a polymath was. A lot of people who come on the show, even if they are a polymath or polymathic, they may not know what it is, but
That's
their answers are
interesting.
usually pretty from the heart, and I really like that.
Hmm. Honestly, if you asked me that question, I genuinely think I would be like something sciencey or something like very like brainy because that's not like I've never actually like honestly I didn't even really know what that word was. You know what I mean? Which is,
Yeah.
but it's a really interesting concept. And then when you explained it earlier, I was like, oh yeah, but there's lots of things that I know that I can do really well. You know what I mean? I'm like, does that make me one too? Maybe
Simona,
not.
I think you're definitely multifaceted. Polymath is more of like a multi-expert. I mean, you might be. I'm not saying you're not. I'm just saying like it's one of those things
Okay.
where multi-specialist might be the best way to kind of put it. But I should
Yeah, I
probably
think I
get to
agree with
the
you.
questions here because we definitely. I have only asked one question.
Really? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Sorry.
So now you're good. I was gonna ask, out of the three pillar content, written, audio, video, what is your favorite to make? It's one of those things where obviously you're a podcaster, but I figure I should still ask.
You know, I that's a really good question. My favorite content out of the three, audio, video, or written, I think is going to be audio.
Mhm.
As a creator, you need good audio for whatever it is that you're doing. And with the audio, you can do all kinds of stuff with video. And with the audio, you can also do stuff with written. You know what I mean? Like you can take that one piece of content and use it in both ways. But also as a consumer of content, I like to hear things, but I also like to read things. It's a very interesting dynamic. Like if I'm watching a video on TikTok,
Mhm.
I will listen to it with I listen to it with the sound off, okay? And I'll watch the video and I read the captions. I don't like
Mm.
hearing the sound all the time. Like sometimes I will, but most of the time I don't. Most of the time I just want to read it without hearing it and just watching it. I also watch like Netflix shows, movies and whatever's with subtitles and I read the subtitles as I'm watching the show. And so it's interesting because like that helps me like process whatever is like being said or whatever. Um so I want to say audio because like I learn best through hearing, but like but it's
Mhm.
I don't know. Like this is like a really now that you asked me this question, now I'm kind of like a little bit like, hold on, which one do I like best? Because it's kind of like this little conundrum because I, I don't consume content with audio all the time, but when I'm creating it, you have to make sure like the audio is the basis of everything. You know what I mean?
As a
Because like you
creator,
still
your
need
audio,
the audio.
but consumer, you're more written,
Yeah, I guess so.
which is
But
interesting
like
because
I
that's
don't like reading
oh,
articles and blogs. Like it's I don't like long
huh.
form reading. Isn't that weird? And I'm not a very good like reader of books, for example. I say that in the sense of like I read a book and I can read it for like 5 minutes and then I'm like, okay, I gotta put this down. Like I'm getting tired, I'll fall asleep or like whatever. But I can listen to an audiobook, no problem.
I had a guest on the Polycast way back when where he told me that he would rather sit down with the book and the audiobook at the same time and listen to it while he's
What?
reading it. Yeah. And that's
That's
how
kind of
he
crazy.
consumed it much more effectively that way by having both stimulation at once.
Interesting.
And one thing I came up with this concept for this Pauline content model, which this show, the Pauline content spotlight creator spotlight, spun off of my newsletter,
Yeah.
which was also called Pauline content.
Love that.
And the model came about because I wanted to create a blog post, video, and podcast all in one. Every episode was all three pillar
Mm.
types, and it was very interesting. I actually deleted the series a little while ago, but the model still stands because I was one of those things where I wanted to share the topic. What I cared about was the actual topic, not necessarily what formats. But some people like you might want to read it or like maybe listen to it in this
Yeah.
case. And then some people would want to watch it. They want to see the hand gestures. They want to see what I'm talking about. Maybe having like a visualization. And some people would want to read it, like full on blog post. And so I wanted to adapt to any particular person. On my website, all my blog posts can be listened to with a little player at the top
Hmm.
of the blog post, for example,
That
in
is
case you
so
want to listen to it while you're
interesting.
walking. Yeah, trying to adapt
Very cool.
content.
I like that. I like that a lot. And also too, you're by creating in that way, you're meeting people exactly where they're at.
Mhm.
You're giving them the option to consume how they want to consume and not being forced to consume content in a way that might not actually be the most beneficial way for them to consume it, which I love.
Think about it, because like, you said you don't like reading blog posts, which means there's a whole bunch of stuff on Medium.com that you've never seen. But
100%.
well, there's one of those things where, like, let's say you're learning something, and let's say you want to learn a specific type of podcasting, or maybe Notion, or some kind of
Mhm.
tool out there, and you're trying to pick up on it. You might only listen to podcasts and maybe watch a handful of videos, but you're
Yeah.
ignoring the blog posts just because you don't
Yeah.
particularly consume that content. But let's
Exactly.
say you're able to listen to all those blog posts, that'd be a different story.
That would be a totally different story. 1,000% it would be so different. And I think too, I'm very much someone that like, cause I feel like I consume a lot of content in a day, probably more so than the average person does, just because of like the nature of my business and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we're always doing content. Like we're doing content like all day long. And so by the end of the day, like my brain is so fried from like reading all this content, hearing all this content, watching different things, writing different things
Mm,
that I'm like, just give me the information that I need. You know what I mean? Very
distill it.
rarely am I listening to things for fun when
Mhm.
I'm trying to learn something. Like I'll watch, content for fun just to be like entertained, like on TikTok and whatever. But and if I read an audiobook, it's like when I'm in the car and driving,
Yeah.
but very rarely will I sit and like watch an entire YouTube, like a how-to YouTube video. I'm like, just give me the 5 steps. Just tell me
Yeah.
what they are. So I like that method, because if you have a YouTube video, instead of having to watch the whole YouTube video for like 7 minutes, if you link it to a blog post, and in the blog post you just have your big header, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, and then someone can just read all of that and just be like done with it. But I feel like I'm like kind of like an anomaly. Like I don't know if most people consume content the way that I do, because I don't think most people work in as much content as I do.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's only so much content we could have in our lives, whether you're creating or
Yes.
consuming. And by creating so much, you can only consume so little. But I was also
True.
going to mention to you there's some tools out there that are like summarizers. So you can summarize different like podcasts or YouTube videos, and it'll give you like a little written summary. So you can just quickly get the idea, like, here's the steps of what you want. So that might be helpful for
What's
you. But
that? Let me
there's a
see.
handful out there. I'll have
Okay,
to
you'll
send
have
to
to
you
send them to me
afterwards.
after.
But there's also a tool. I can't remember any names right now. I can remember some of the other names, sort of summarizing tools, but there's also a tool to allow you to listen to blog posts. Just like not the one I use. Beyond Words is what I use, but this
Okay.
one's more for a consumer, so you can just literally put in any article and just listen to it.
That is really cool. I might
So
have
that'll
to do
help you
this.
out. Speaking of tools, what tools do you use for creation and repurposing?
Ooh, okay. So I say we as my agency, but also I as like my own self. We use
Mhm.
Descript for all the editing and like creating show notes and
Mhm.
pulling out the key parts and quotes and stuff like that. Then after Descript, just depending on the client side, depending on who the client is, we use a combination of Canva and Headliner to
Yeah.
create some video content, and CapCut. But for my own self, my own content, I use Opus Clips. So I just
Mm.
literally take the video, drop it into, yep, exactly. I just drop it right into Opus Clips. I do it for both of my brands, Happiness Happens and my brand, Volt Productions. And yeah, it's just the best. It's the best tool to be able to create content in a really fast way.
Definitely love that. I was telling you just before this call, I've made 1,500 clips of Opus, so I totally understand.
It's
It's
so
one of those
amazing.
things. where I tried pretty much every other repurposing tool out there. I'm not even being hyperbolic
Mm.
about it. I've tried pretty much all of them. And Opus was the one that got me to finally actually be able to do stuff with it and come up with a lot of content. So yeah, definitely.
And they're always evolving and they're always
Yeah.
creating, like they're always changing the way. Like even I've only been with them for like about I think like 2 months now, and
Mhm.
even in that short 2 months, I can see the updates and the changes that they're making,
Oh
and it's
man, it's
awesome.
crazy.
I love it.
They're cranking out things like left and right. One thing I actually was
Yeah.
trying to convince them to do. So there was two things I've been trying to convince them. One is switch to create an audio visualizer, so like Headliner essentially to
Okay.
compete with them. Because Headliner and Zuddle are the two tools out there for visualizers for the most part. There's a few other ones, but those are the two big ones. They have not had any competition for a very long time. And I thought
Hmm.
that Opus is already finding the clips, and it might actually be a pretty easy thing to add, just a visualizer to it, and
Yeah.
that way they
And
can
you
they
know, well, sorry, you were just like reminding me. On Headliner, they have this tool. It's called Eddy, and
Mhm.
it only works off of audio right now. I'm pretty sure, unless they've made an update, and unless that update has been pushed out to like include video. But I'm not 100%
Mhm.
sure. But I know they do it with audio, and it's really cool. Like you can go in, and it'll pick titles for you. It'll pick parts of your content for you. Like it'll do all of that stuff, and it'll give you the suggested clips and the suggested parts. You just click on which part you want, and then it can go into that timeline thing where you can go and you can add different elements to it, and you can change the captions and change the look and the style and all of it. So it's a really cool like way um to use both of those methods together. I haven't used it a whole lot, just only because I tend to do more video content creation and it's
Right.
only available audio currently. But yeah, if someone's listening to this and they know that you can do like video on there now, just let me know because I could be wrong.
Yeah, well, at this point, I feel like Opus already does it so much that I feel like they can do both. But yeah, and then so you've made a lot of content around podcasting, obviously at this point, and so what makes you so vibrantly passionate about it?
That's a good question. I just really like this industry and I like that people have the opportunity to share their message in a really impactful way and in a way that their audience can consume it and their audience like needs to hear it, you know?
Mhm.
And so I don't know I don't know if that fully answers the question. Does it
I
answer the
think
question?
so. It's one
Yeah.
of those things where when we met at Podcast Movement, for example,
Mhm.
and I noticed when I was there just the level of excitement everyone had and the
Mhm.
passion of just like, hey, if you have a question, let's like share, let's talk. Let's like they were happy to share knowledge. They were happy to
Yes.
just help one another. And it was just one of those things where that's because we're podcasters. Like we're all part of the same
Exactly.
space.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's what I love so much about like this community. And that's what I like about creating content. That's what I like about sharing because it's like, I don't know. I think about this often too because I have a lot of producer friends, and it's like, there's more than enough clients to go around. There's more than enough content to go around. Nothing that anyone is doing is inherently quote unquote new,
Mhm.
but the creativity that comes from your mind is your unique asset. And so, AI is incredible, right? Because it can help us do a lot of things. But AI can generate ideas, but AI can't necessarily generate ideas that somebody else may not have like completely thought of before because it's pulling from a place of where content already exists. And so when I create content, I try and bring humor to it. Like when I'm
Mhm.
creating podcast content, I try and just bring my own spin into it because you know, people are going to different people for all kinds of reasons to learn, to be entertained, to be educated, like whatever the reason is that someone comes across your page, right? But really, what they're staying for is for the person,
Yeah.
right? Because you and I can share the exact same message. You will hit a different audience than I will. You know what I mean? Because of who we are, how we are, the way we communicate, the way we talk, like all of those things. And I think that's really important to remember is that you have to continue to put your spin on it. So even if like, your content is generated from AI or your script is or whatever, what is your unique spin that goes on it? Because that is the thing that people are being drawn to. That's the thing that makes people want to come back, want to subscribe, want to follow, and want to do all that.
And it made me think a lot actually about my main channel too, where I talk about being multidisciplinary, being polymathic, because that's my meta niche, this polymathy thing.
Mm,
A lot of my videos and topics, I have multiple sub niches, I have multiple different topics. And
yeah.
so my channel looks scattered to like the average person, looks like there's too many things going on. But in actuality, like I actually do have that premise of like, hey, that's who I am. I'm multidisciplinary, multifaceted, but it's me who they're coming back for, if that makes sense. Like it's
Exactly.
because it's my channel. Yeah,
Exactly.
personal brand.
Exactly. And that's, I think, a key piece too, is the content that you're creating should be an extension of who you are, and it
Mhm.
shouldn't feel too far off of who you are as a human being and like your humor. Like, you don't create content in a way that you're not actually. Like, if you don't like telling jokes, don't create content that is like that is centers around you telling jokes. It's just not going to land. People are going to be like, "What are you doing?"
It is interesting. I've only had a limited experience of this with podcast movement where I met someone who I was a content creator online who I learned from, Shannon Hernandez. I met him in person. He's a
Yeah.
YouTuber about podcasting, and he was super cool. Like I just remember being a budding podcaster and learning just different things and watching some of his videos back in those early days. And then just randomly seeing him on the last day of podcast movement and meeting him. And he was the same kind of person he was in the videos. And it's just one of those things where it's nice to have that genuineness. I've heard
Mhm.
stories from other creators where they met somebody who they really admired or learned from, and they weren't the same person
I've
in
heard that
person.
too, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is
Which is,
kind of disappointing, because
yeah.
it's like maybe you'll agree with me when I say this, but like our listener today, all the listeners on your show, the listeners on my show, you create a relationship with them, right?
Mhm.
And if you're on a podcast episode and you're recording something and someone is coming back week over week to hear what you have to say, and then you meet them in person. So I'll take myself as an example. Like, the exact way that you and I are talking right now is exactly how I am when we meet in
Yeah.
person. But if we met in person and you had listened to my podcast for an entire year and I showed up and I was like, "Oh, yeah, hi." Or
Listen.
like, "I gotta go. Sorry, I don't have time for this and I don't have time for you." Like, could you imagine? Like, could you
Oh,
imagine? Like, and then you would be like, hold on, like, who is this person? Like, what is this persona that goes on the
yeah.
podcast? But then you meet them in real life and they're not at all the same way. I think the best content drives from your own authentic self and being. If you
Yeah.
can't be the exact way that you are in person on your like on here's the thing that's challenging too, though. Like, yes, like, you have somewhat of like a quote unquote persona when you're like doing your show or whatever, because you have to position yourself in a way as like you're the thought leader in the subject that you're talking about, right? Absolutely. But if the basis of who you are and the personality that shines through is not similar or even remotely close to the person that you are when you're in person with someone, that's a little red flaggy. It's like, okay, so you've just created a character then.
Yeah.
Like, it's a character. And then people develop a relationship with a character. And then it's weird.
I definitely understand that because I was actually going to bring that up too. So I think we're delving into something here that's interesting. It's
Hmm.
okay to have a persona, and I want to really kind of clarify that. Like
Yes,
it's totally
it
okay to have a
is.
persona. Just make sure that's related to who you are. It's almost like a more saturated version of you, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
I used to
That makes a
teach
lot of
water
sense.
aerobics quite a bit, and I had a even though I wouldn't always be in the energetic mood that I would be when I'm teaching, I had to put on that persona. I had to put on the
Yeah.
actor's mask because like they come here to be energized and motivated to work out, and so I was just a more heightened version of myself. I'm that kind of cheerful, energetic person no matter what, but
Yes,
but I
you are
definitely had
very
a
much so.
I had to crank it up a little bit for the class. Is what I'm saying.
Exactly, exactly. I agree with you. Yes, having a persona 1000%, like, you need that, because it's like, I guess what I'm saying is just like, don't create a persona that's so far off from who
Oh
you
yeah.
are and then like be like an asshole when you meet someone in real life. You know what I
Well,
mean? Like,
someone I think I definitely want to make sure we drive that point home too, where it's like what someone is saying here is that you want to make sure you're not creating a false persona or
that's
something that's
right.
like not who you are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And also, we can caveat too that some instances require you being, having a different persona than who you are. Like, if you're
Mhm.
acting and if it's like a storytelling podcast and if you're, you know what I mean? Like, whatever that
Yeah.
is. But if you're like a personal brand, I'm talking specifically personal brand.
Yeah.
There's like theater and all kinds of other stuff that like narrative style podcasts, like all of those are different, and like, yeah, you might actually have to play a character in
Yeah.
some of that stuff. I'm talking specifically building a personal brand. So,
Yeah. It's like 'cause your personal brand is who you are. One of my favorite questions on this show is can you share your favorite story that's happened to you as a creator?
ooh, my favorite story that's happened to me as a creator, you know there honestly isn't a particular story that comes to mind. I haven't really had like any crazy things happen as a creator. But I think the most memorable thing about getting to be in this space is getting to meet all kinds of people and having opportunities to speak on different stages
Mm.
and, meeting new friends in the industry and like growing as a person through the content that we're creating. Like I feel like that for me is one of my favorite parts. So I don't have like a specific story, but it's more a whole overall experience, if you will.
I definitely have a couple memories of you from Podcast Movement where you were introducing other people together. You were
Hmm.
being that kind of gregarious person. Like I remember us sitting down and you introduced me to your friend that you were sitting with, and we became friends because of that. Or like when we first met, I think we met through like Lloyd George, and
Yeah.
it was just like that same group. And I was saying hi to him, then I said hi to you, and it was one of those things where you were literally introducing someone else to someone else, and it was just like that kind of
Mm.
dynamic. And so you are that kind of social person even in general too. And I feel like that might be why, perhaps.
1,000%. I really value connection. Like I really value who can I introduce to who, but I also just think it comes from just like a genuine kindness. Like I want people to get to know each other. Like you never know where your next opportunity is going to come from. And I don't even look at it as just that. It's just, I think that people should meet each other, and
Mhm.
I've never been someone who follows the, you know, typical like I'm not like a catty person. I'm not a clicky person or anything like that. Like my friend is your friend is my friend, and that's how I roll. But that drives from my own personal values of like who I am as a human. Like kindness, care, and
Mhm.
connection are my top three values in life. It's how I lead my life. It's how I lead business. It's how I lead every single relationship and everything that I do. And so the fact that you picked up on that, that's actually really cool. And that's really interesting because that's just me living in integrity with my own values. I want to connect other people with I want to connect people together because I think there's a level of care, connectivity, and kindness that happens with that
Mm.
that you can't replicate.
There is a term called superconnector, and it's based off like a book. And I
Hmm.
feel like if you haven't read that yet, you should listen to it.
Okay, I love that you said if you haven't read that yet, you should listen to it.
Well, before I ask the next question here, I definitely just want to mention too, podcast movement. It was really funny. I knew from the get go I wasn't going to learn anything from the panels. Really, like
Yeah,
most of the tools they're talking about, most of the AI stuff they're talking about, even podcasting stuff, I was
yeah.
either already going to know or it was just going to be repeated the same thing.
Yeah. That's actually a disappointing piece about podcast movement for me because I've actually
Mm,
never been to podcast movement before. I've been to Podfest a couple of times, which was really great, really cool. But podcast movement, here's the difference between the two. And I like am totally fine like saying this like on here because I would say it to them even if I saw them in person. I feel like the Podfest is really cool because you have all kinds of different panels and you have all kinds of different speakers that are specialized in their niche. Okay.
mm,
It can be someone, you can have someone on the stage who has like 2,000 followers, is running a business maybe and they're doing really well, but they're not like, a multiple million follower person, whatever. Podcast movement to me felt very much like, unless you're part of a corporation, you don't get stage time. And I'm like, that's fine, but they're not really in the nitty gritty. Corps are not in the nitty gritty of what indie podcasters are doing. You know what I mean? Like, so it's nice, but it also would be really cool to see people who are in the actual industry day in, day out, who are doing this work like day in, day out, instead of, some of the AI stuff that I learned was like kind of cool, but like my friends who test the AI stuff know 100 times more. I don't know if 100 times more than what people are presenting, but their presentations would be way more in
mm.
depth. So the level of expertise, like I'm sure whoever's sharing about AI like knows exactly what they're talking about. But I just find that like indie creators, podcasters, people who are entrepreneurs drive home so much value. And that's the difference between the two. Podfest, you have a ton of value. Podcast movement, very much there for the hallways. But they're both beautiful experiences. Like I love
Yeah.
both. So I can't be a hater. I'm not a hater.
Thank you for sharing that though, and I think it
Of
kind of leads to
course.
kind of what I was trying to say too, is where I was wanting to mention that I went into that conference with networking as my main intention. Like I spent the entire
Mm.
time trying to network with people, and like all the
Love
after
that.
part. I went to every after party, even the one that was kind of slow on Tuesday. But I went to all of them. The first one, actually, the Monday night before the podcast actually started, the movement started, was actually the most lucrative. Surprisingly, not lucrative, but like effective because I met
Enriching,
some
like, yeah.
enriching. Yeah, it was one of those things where instead of going to the panels, I went in the hallways and the expo to try
Mhm.
to meet people. That's what I was like, kind of mentioning there. But it's interesting that you mentioned podcasts as more interesting for the panel. So I will say the last day podcast movement had a lot of smaller creators. Like there was one person who's not really small, but he was not like a company person, was Sun Yi, and he was one of the people who I connected with at the conference, and he was
Yes.
really cool. And he was like kind of what you're talking about there. He's in the trenches, if you will.
Yeah, exactly, which is really cool, and, like, I love that. I love that.
Only a couple more questions here before we end up wrapping up here. What
Sure.
Since this show is kind of talking about podcast creation, but also repurposing, it spun off the repurposing newsletter. What does content repurposing mean to you?
I think content repurposing is opportunity, right? You create one thing and you get so many different pieces out of it. I think it brings like a structure and a clarity to what you're doing. And I really like that because it's like you create one piece of content, you get a blog, you get social media content, you can do a
Yeah,
video and all these different pieces. I think content repurposing really takes the struggle out of trying to hit all of those different things. Because if someone's like, I want a podcast, I want a YouTube channel, and I want to have a blog, great. Start a video podcast and you'll have all three, you know?
exactly. Yeah, it was that same with the poly and content thing I mentioned earlier too, where you could have all three. Just have that strategy in mind, and then you can repurpose from there, disseminate from there.
Exactly.
So, what do you have coming in the line that you're looking forward to?
Well, I'm very much looking forward to speaking at Podfest. I'm excited about that. I'm going to be on a panel with one, two, three, four other people, and we are talking about being a podcaster for hire. So that'll be a really, really cool panel, really cool topic. And I'm also really excited. I'm in the process of rebranding my entire agency, and currently it's just coined under my name. But it's gonna be as of the end of January. It's gonna be Volt Productions, VOLT, which I'm really excited about. With that comes all new like masterclass series, a whole new strategy to help creators that already have podcasts up and running. And I'm just really looking forward to the conversations that I'm going to have on my show as well. So that like on a business side, that's what I'm really excited about. On a personal side, I'm excited. I have some fun travel lined up for the year this year. So of course, I'm just always excited to get. I love being on a
Yeah,
plane. If you follow astrology by any sense, I'm a Sagittarius, and Sagittarius are always traveling. So that's me. I like to travel. So I'm really excited about that.
I feel like I remember you talking about how much you were excited about traveling. I was like kind of astounded, like how many different places you went to in a short time span. I'm pretty sure I remember
It's
talking to us
true.
about that. Yeah.
It's very true. Very likely.
Where can people find you online?
So you can find me at my new website, voltproductions.co. You can also find me at my personal brand website, which is simonacostantini.com. My handle is at Simona with 2 underscores on Instagram and on TikTok. And my podcast, I have 2. One is Happiness Happens, and the other one is As It Relates to Podcasting. So you can check both of those out wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Wonderful. I'll have some links in the description for you. And then this is Simona Costantini and Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator on the Poly and Content Creator Spotlight. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I loved it.